Hi, Choose Recovery friends. My name is Becky, and I'm a Christian in recovery from addiction to drugs and alcohol. Hi. I have to say just real quick, this wasn't planned, but I just need to defend my taste that is a song that Facebook, we can only use certain songs. And so it kind of cracked me up because the tech team actually picked that for me. And so being from Kentucky, I thought, it sounds a little country, doesn't it? Maybe it's just me. But I actually wanted a different song, but that's okay. All right, can you guys please join me for a quick prayer for our time together? God, I just thank you for all that you continue to teach us. I pray for the strength to be brutally honest with both myself and others listening, that you might be strengthened and that you can be glorified. We humbly ask for your spirits to speak words of truth and wisdom and hope into our hearts this evening. Amen. So I grew up in Kentucky, as I said, in a little town called Frankfort, and it's actually the capital, but most people haven't heard of it. And I really grew up thinking I had a pretty idyllic childhood, and in many ways it really was. I was the youngest of 3 girls and lived with both of my parents. My mother was a high school English teacher, and my dad was a pastor. Thankfully, by the time I was 4, my dad went and was a campus pastor at the local college, which is sort of like being a youth pastor for college kids. So I can still say that there's a weird pressure in a small town. There are maybe 3 high schools, and it's kind of strange to grow up in the same place and everyone know that your dad's a pastor. There's a weird pressure. Now that I'm older, I recognize that some of that was very self-imposed. I have to take a deep breath. Okay. My adolescent and teenage years were the glorious 1980s, where no one had any problems. We had big hair and bright clothes, and I was just certain that life was meant to be golden. In actuality, as a society, we were really guarded with talking about it, and some of that was just the time we were living in. And I learned the same kind of coping in my own family. My father went blind when I was 8 years old, and there were serious marital issues with my parents, and some of their issues did not match the Christianity that I was supposedly being raised in. I began to have a part of myself that I showed the world and a part that I locked inside. I felt a pressure to not add to my parents' pain, which was obviously a lot, dealing with a disability with my dad and the marriage issues. And so I kept a lot of things hidden, and I formed some really bad coping skills of locking things away. The good news in this part of my story was that I was taught to love God, and fairly young, and I really, really did. Jesus became especially real to me when I was in middle school and read the 4 Gospels. Unfortunately, I often approached my relationship with God in the same way that I did with people, letting him see some parts of me and keeping other parts at a comfortable distance. When I was in high school, I read a small pamphlet called My Heart, Christ's Home. In the metaphor, the author walks through the rooms of the man's heart, and Jesus helps him look at what might need to be different. They go into a bedroom, and he talks about a poster that might be looking like he's worshiping them more. But the very last room is the man's closet, and he talks about getting nervous as Jesus goes near the closet, because that's where the skeletons are. I can vividly remember reading that and feeling like I personally could not even open the closet door myself for my own heart, let alone let Jesus inside to renovate. There were questions inside, things like, why did my dad go blind? Where is God when I'm really sad? My trust was with my human experiences, and I made my relationship with God that same way. I married my husband, Wes, 1 week shy of my 21st birthday. So I can honestly say, 27 years later, that in some ways we grew up together. The marriage road has not always been easy, as I'm sure is not a shock to anyone that's been married. And there were some cracks in our communication patterns. We both came to marriage with unaddressed wounds from childhood and became enmeshed until we both found our own healing journeys. For much of our marriage, we have argued like temperamental children instead of grown adults. We welcomed our first son, Caleb, in 1999. You see him in the pictures. And then in 2002, our son, Daniel, died of anencephaly during birth. A few months prior, I was attacked in our home, but able to escape without any harm done to me or my son, Caleb, or so I thought. Excuse me. Because I had been walking with God prior to this, I experienced some deep hurt and felt abandoned by God. But instead of taking it honestly to God, because I didn't really do that anywhere, I locked it aside and didn't really tell him the whole story of what was going on in my heart. So I just, excuse me, really thought that I could pray it away. All of those events worked like a final earthquake in my cracked relationship with God. I really just didn't understand. I tried to take my pain to God, but after 6 months, when my humanity saw no improvement, I decided I needed to take control of the situation. It started with psychiatric medications, which got increased, and doctors who meant well kept adding when I kept saying I'm still not okay. This added a lot of weight gain to weight that I already hadn't lost from the pregnancy of losing my child, and led to very low self-esteem. And again, I thought I could solve it. This time was with the diet program. And actually, there were 3 or 4 different diet programs along the way. The end result would be to put on another 15 pounds, plus an increasingly problematic relationship with food. I thought I found the answer in 2007 at a local weight loss company who uses a controlled substance for appetite suppression. I did fairly well with it for a couple of years, but never addressed why I wanted to eat so much or what my pain that was still in there was about. I do remember the first 30 minutes after I took that medication were always the best. Suddenly, my outlook was sunnier. My productivity would increase, or so I could quickly pick up the house, and I always thought I was just so much more fun. I had been depressed for years, and so my skewed thinking really felt like this made me a better mother, friend, and wife. After that, though, my memory becomes fuzzy because addiction slowly worked its way in like it does. Lost my place. Okay. I became very loose with what I used to think of as just an occasional glass of pink Moscato. My dad's parents were both alcoholics, but because I had had occasional drinks throughout my adulthood, I really was not real vigilant about the amounts or focused on how prone I probably was to addiction. At my worst, I would have a couple of bottles of wine a night, and this was all intermixed with stress at work, where I was counseling people who were dying. I felt this responsibility that really goes back to my childhood, from being a youngest child in a situation where things were a little bit bleak. I really thought that all I had to offer the world was to be light, happy, and hopeful. And that becomes pretty hard when you're storing up this much. And so just like addiction and drugs and alcohol and all these things have a way of doing, they lie. And so it was like, this is your way to be light and hope to people who need it. I started relying on an extra diet pill before therapy sessions, and I was convinced it made me a more compassionate counselor. My relationship with God was more last-minute prayers of distress. The diet pills quickly got out of control, and the behavior only sustained itself a couple of months before I was reprimanded for irritability with my superiors. I do know that there was one day when I took at least 18 diet pills, even though 6 was a maximum, and even that, once I did the research, was highly questionable. I didn't do that research till after it became clear that there was a serious problem. At some point, I was just stuck in that ridiculous and awful cycle that I know many of you know, and it's a miserable place to be. The diet pills would soon make my skin feel like it was crawling when they wore off, and I would overcompensate with my anti-anxiety medicine. My account got flagged at Walgreens due to these medications, and at the time it seemed like normal behavior to go beg and show the pharmacist I was shaking, but now it's embarrassing to realize there was a good reason for it to be flagged. My dentist wondered why my teeth were suddenly decaying really rapidly when they had been fine before. So 2 things happened that got me started on my recovery journey. The first was I was written up at work for my attitude, which in my past had not ever been an issue. I was probably, in all honesty, about a month short of being fired, and the writing was on the wall. My marriage was holding on by a thread as Wes started attending Al-Anon, and I knew that I was negatively influencing my adolescent son with my erratic behavior. Even worse than that, though, was my emotional and thought life. I lost every shred of hope and would not have cared if I had died. Many days I really found very little reason to want to live, and I felt sure that everyone would be better off if I was not around. I saw no worth in my life, and I really was barely holding on. It was as bad as I've ever experienced. The second thing that happened was that I was fortunate enough to go on a trip to Israel with our church right after hitting that rock bottom. God made it very clear to me that, like the Apostle Peter, I was drowning because I had taken my eyes off of Jesus. I prayed at the Western Wall and offered my life back to God. I prayed that He would show me the way of real life. And this was actually the first time I really laid down my stubborn and self-centered will. When I returned, I got into counseling. My doctor released me from his care and started weaning me off of all the medications, as it became clear to even him that I had a problem with anxiety medications. I think he had also been in some trouble with the pharmacy, who had called him. Yeah. So these might be signs, but at the time I was like, no. I also had to admit under his care that, and especially this has been good for me in recovery, that at some point I was being really manipulative. And I didn't even want to be honest with myself about that, but you'd have to have this kind of cycle going. I begrudgingly started recovery meetings on August 8th, 2018. And I say begrudgingly because I thought surely there was a weekly meeting or an easier way to get better. In many ways, I was still in denial. And truthfully, I was probably going to the meetings to make the people in my life happy. In my first 90 days of AA and NA meetings, I had to pray for a spirit to remain teachable because the whole situation really kind of shocked me. I felt a large dose of shame, and looking back, a lot of my spirit was still really fighting the process. I felt some part of me was dying. And in reality, looking back, it was, but in a good way. I had been fighting to stay above water for so long that I didn't realize how much self and pride had worked their way into my heart. As I became aware of my own selfish behavior, the pain that I had inflicted on others, particularly my husband and son, became evident and broke my heart. However, one of my first realizations of my problematic thinking was that of the victim mentality. I also had to it took a while for me to admit to myself that that was what I do, because in your head, you're like, but I actually do have a good reason for feeling sorry for myself. But finally, one of those days, God was like, no, that's you. Here I was whining, and I had to realize it was time to grow up. I had and have many things to be grateful for, and I've learned to make a daily choice to see the good and remember the ways that I've been blessed. God taught me something at every single meeting, every single day. Not only that, but He would usually, frequently use the exact person who I would have assumed had nothing to offer me. I started learning to really listen when people talked. One of the bravest people I ever met was a friend in my home group who came in to the 7 a.m. meeting the morning after she relapsed. I recognize that I can learn something from anyone if I really pay attention. Meetings were like free group therapy, which I actually do like therapy. And I found that I felt so honored. This was a great surprise, too, just to be in a room with people who are truly searching to live meaningful lives with God's help. The rooms of AA were the last place I would have ever hoped to be. But once I began practicing humility, I realized what a gift this actually was to me. And I include those in my gratitude list with God now. He made a way when I could not see a way. I began loving my morning group, who sometimes read the big book and sometimes the 12 and 12. I loved that AA was not just a think positive self-help group. It honors lessons that I have been taught in morality in the Bible with simple how-to behavior. I started finding more and more of myself in the big book and found it no accident that chapter 2 spoke of a minister's son. I continue to laugh and sometimes cry at all the ways that I thought I was terminally unique, when in actuality I was suffering and questioning and striving like the rest of all mankind. This shift and right-sizing of myself was a crucial step of recovery and restoration with my walk with God. Around 6 weeks in, it became clear that I would need to get a sponsor because it's emphasized so strongly. It felt like the point of no return. I thought, now I'm really in it. Pastor Arlene put me in contact with my sponsor, Alexis, who is here tonight. This was another frightening step for me. Vulnerability is really challenging. My sponsor is extremely gracious and kind. Early on, I asked her about what I've heard about step 5. I said, when is it that I tell you all the worst things I've ever done? And she smiled and said, how about now? And then when I went on to tell her, she did not bat an eye, and she came right back. And she kept coming back to meet with me, even though it was clear this was not a mutually beneficial relationship, especially at the beginning. My growing trust in her began restoring my faith in humanity. Again, I realized that God was blessing me and restoring me in spite of my deep pain. The 12 steps have been life-giving and life-directing. The 4th step brought me such clarity about my own character defects. I realized that I have a ridiculously fragile ego, and I will never learn to grow until I can name and face the selfish and self-centered ways I'm prone to act. I started learning to take every thought to God. 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, we demolish arguments and every pretension against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. I'm learning to do that now and learning to truly take all of myself to the foot of the cross. Our church did a study, was it last spring or last fall? It's been a little while. But it was called Wounds That Heal, and talking about finding our healing in the cross. I actually picture it that way sometimes when I go to pray, and that's been really helpful. I confess and envision laying my thoughts actually at the feet of Jesus. Sometimes he's just sitting, and I sit next to him, kind of like Martha, or Mary, I guess. And sometimes I even lay my family members there as well. And that helps when I pray, I'm leaving them with you. Making amends was so much harder than I ever thought. Because my addiction ran alongside my life in secret, it was hidden from everyone but my husband. Each encounter involved explaining my low points and overthinking how people did or did not look at me. But each amends brought peace when finished. By far, the hardest amends to make was with my mother. I have never felt skinny enough or pretty enough or talented or dressed well enough to her liking. She's been very verbal in what felt to me like I was not enough. In fact, in counseling, I realized that I was in beauty pageants as a teenager for her approval more than anything else. She was the last person I made amends to, and it became a 3-part episode because I chickened out the first 2 times. I don't know if anybody else has done that, but that was totally what happened for me. And I only did it partially the first 2 times. My family has never been real with each other, and here I was admitting complete failure. Your daughter's a drug addict. Congrats. So Um, there's something about not feeling loved by these, very important people in our lives that, for my mom, it really struck me at my core. By the time I did complete the amends, I was able to recognize through lots of prayer and seeking with God that I may have been kind of a hard child to raise. My mom surprisingly apologized for periods of my childhood where she failed me, and we were able to exchange grace with one another, and deep healing happened. About 2 months into my sobriety, I was worrying over many things, and God also reminded me of this verse: "Trust in the Lord your God, and lean not on your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight." That is Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. I learned it as a kid, but I never really learned to apply it. I felt fortunate that God would speak to me. I've learned to feel honored that the Bible exists at all. This is especially challenging as I wait for slow healing process with my son Caleb. God really emphasizes the part about leaning not on my own understanding. I hold a lot of shame at not being emotionally available for him, and he's been able to share feelings of deep pain at my behavior. I had to confess to God that I still work really hard to figure it out, even when I've prayed about it. I have felt him encouraging me to give up the endless fight and truly get to know him. Perhaps my greatest lesson, though, came in step 3. As a reminder, this step says, we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Now, when I started recovery and reviewed the 12 steps, I can honestly say step 3 seemed like the step that seemed like it could be the easiest. I thought I already did that. When I started really getting honest with myself and with God, though, I began realizing that I'd sort of turned over my life to God, but I think I really held my will back. I think I added addendums to God's directives. In particular, I remember singing a song back in church called "Here I Am." It used to be big at missions conferences, and it said, "Here I am, Lord, it is I, Lord, or is it I, Lord? I have heard you calling in the night. I will go, Lord, where you lead me. I will hold your people in my sight." That song used to make me so uncomfortable, and it really just represents my lack of trust. I think I held back and I saw God as a big bad sheriff who was going to send me someplace awful if I really let him be in charge and run the show. That view of God came from my brokenness, from my limited history and my human understanding of God. These thoughts represented my lack of trust and lack of submission to his healing. I have learned to lay down my will every single day, and that may be my most important lesson of recovery. I pray, too, for strength, just to give more of my will. As I'm giving it, I'm starting to recognize there's still a part of me fighting that, and so I just pray that God keeps helping that part of me that's fighting. Some days it's easier than others, but I've given up that fight. After some years, I began to realize that God was telling me, when he was telling me that I was like Peter, he may have had some other implications besides the drowning scene. Most biblical scholars say that Peter's greatest sin is pride, and I confess I suffer from that as well. I didn't recognize it because my pride is not so much like, oh, I think I'm so great, but more just that I would really like to be in charge. I want what I want, like a 2-year-old. Some of my personal strength is a gift from God, but left in my own hands, I will always make a mess of it, and I never want to go back to that way of living. I'm realizing that I have few, if any, answers, and that's okay. My daily submission and prayers to God, not my will, but yours be done, have become vital. To summarize, I have to say that recovery has been the greatest journey of my life because it brought me back to God, who had and has so much to teach me. Recovery brought me back to the heart of Jesus. I had an important prayer session with a Theophostic trained therapist, and God gave me 2 visions. One was of he and I descending down into a deep valley of my pain, and he was encouraging me, we just have to go one step at a time, one more step. The other was of Jesus holding me while I held this lifeless body of my son Daniel. I had been wondering so long where he was when that happened. And in this vision, Jesus was weeping right alongside me and holding me like a shepherd holds a lamb. My walls continue to slowly get broken down, and Jesus and I have started clearing out the closets of my heart. I learned to show him the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we continue to work on things. Sometimes I'm surprised by what he shows me, but God has renewed my will to live and to seek his purpose for my life. He is rebuilding my marriage, he is restoring my family relationships, and he can do the same for you. I pray that for you, and I pray that you'll let Jesus into your heart as much as you can tonight so that he can help you start restoring it. Thank you.